thank everyone for being here today, and I want to thank Sinclair Community College for being our hosts. We appreciate them providing us this venue for the community to get together to have this important discussion on sequestration and defense cuts. We have with us today, of course, elected officials, State Senator Peggy Lehner, State Representative Jim Butler. We are also going to be joined by Marilyn Reed, Alan Anderson, and Rick Corrales, Greene County Commissioners, who had a County Commission meeting this morning and who are at this point on their way here. I know that all of us share the same concern for our local economy and for our defense industry, as well as our men and women who are in uniform. It was 1 year ago that the word sequestration began to creep into the lexicon of the budget debate. For months, Congress had been debating how to deal with the economic questions surrounding an increase in our debt limit. At a time when foreign nations own nearly $4.5 trillion of our over $15 trillion debt, proposed cuts in the Budget Control Act, called sequestration, could have serious implications for our national security. As a member of the House Armed Services Committee, this is an issue of concern for me, both with respect to looking at our community, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in our region, but also the issue of national security. That's why I was concerned with the national security funding and how it would be subjected to an initial $175 billion cut in the final version of the Budget Control Act that was passed by Congress and signed by the President. Furthermore, if the Super Committee failed to act, I could not in good conscience support a backup plan which relies on significant defense cuts. That's why I voted against raising the debt limit and the Budget Control Act, which has these cuts in it for the defense industry. Unfortunately, due to the failure of the Super Committee, what we find ourselves in today, and with the failure of Congress and the President to act, $492 billion in total defense cuts could be facing the Department of Defense and our community January 2nd, 2013 because of this inaction. Throughout this debate, I have advocated for our government to cut spending and cap it at a reasonable and responsible level so that we may be able to balance our budget. We must remember that under the Constitution, Congress's primary responsibility is to provide for our common defense, to raise and support armies, and to provide and maintain a Navy. Fulfilling that obligation and meeting our budgetary responsibilities are not mutually exclusive. As a nation, we should be able to provide for our defense and at the same time balance our budget. One should not come at the expense of the other. This is a critical moment both for our nation and for armed forces. Our military remains strong and morale among service members remains high. But we cannot continue to operate with a strained force or we will not be able to meet the obligations of the future. In fact, the vice chiefs of each of our branches of the military echoed this same sentiment at a hearing before the House Armed Services Committee on readiness. General Philip Breedlove, Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, stated that some components of the Air Force are right at the ragged edge. Furthermore, additional proposed cuts in the bill would result in a fundamental restructure of what it is our nation expects from our Air Force. Our national defense has always been a bipartisan issue in the halls of Congress. Members from both sides of the aisle recognize that the role of our military is important and it protects our nations and advances our goals of foreign policy. More importantly, for our region in the state of Ohio, these cuts will have far-ranging consequences from the Defense Department's civilian workforce to the contractors who support vital national security projects. The Bipartisan Policy Center estimated in a recent report that sequestration would result in the loss of about 1 million jobs in 2013 and 2014 and a 0.5% cut to America's already meager economic growth. Lockheed Martin is likely to notify the vast majority of its 123,000 workers that they're at risk of being laid off, said Greg Walters, the company's Vice President of Legislative Affairs. The company has little choice, he explained, because federal law requires large employers to provide 2 months' notice to workers facing layoffs. In Ohio and the Dayton region, the cuts will be equally as significant. Currently, 25,000 Department of Defense civilian personnel are employed in Ohio. The House Armed Services Committee has estimated that as many as 6,000 of them could lose their jobs if sequestration falls in place. Also, in the fiscal year 09, prime Department of Defense contracts in Ohio, $6.25 billion of the Armed Services Committee estimates are that the cuts would decrease that by $1.5 billion. Other studies are not as optimistic as the House Armed Services Committee estimates. According to a study by George Mason University, sequestration could cost in Ohio 21,000 jobs. So the estimates that we're looking at are somewhere between 6,000 and over 20,000 jobs that could be affected in Ohio. These are significant reasons to be concerned, along with the lack of action by the administration, the Pentagon, in planning these cuts. Already we know the President has exempted active duty personnel and veterans from these cuts. Also, the acting director of the Office of Management and Budget has said these cuts will be applied across accounts equally. Clearly, though, that is not an efficient method for action. How do you build a plane when you only have 80% of the funding? This is why this forum that we're having today is so important. I appreciate the elected officials who are here. We've been joined by two of our Green County commissioners, Commissioner Anderson and Commissioner Reed. I know that Commissioner Prowse is on his way. We had earlier indicated that you were in a meeting, and we appreciated that you were going to be joining us.
Thank you.
Before we begin, and I recognize the other elected officials for their comments, I'd like to provide some basis for our discussion. If we could look at, we have 4 slides. We can bring the first one up. This first slide will show that one more. There we go. In framing the debate on cuts in spending, many people ask, well, why shouldn't we be cutting the Department of Defense? And one thing that people need to understand is that even if we eliminated every dollar we spend in the Department of Defense, which is slightly over $600 billion annually, we could not balance our budget. That the deficits are so excessive that we spend more in the red ink than we do on the Department of Defense. Clearly, the other areas of the budget need to be addressed. Here you see that the Department of Defense, in all federal spending in FY13, is only 17% of the budget. But in this debate, as you can see, both with sequestration and the cuts that are planned, defense is receiving 53% of the cuts. Now, there's not many people who have a business who would say, I'm going to cut my budget and I'm going to do half of those cuts from 17% of my overall budget. And in fact, as we all know, that 17% is the most important because it keeps us safe. Now let's give us some perspective as to where federal spending in defense has been. Next slide. Here, if you look at the baseline, here is the Clinton-era defense levels of spending. And you see that as a constant level. And you see what's happened with Iraq and Afghanistan and the Afghanistan drawdown. And then you see what would happen with sequestration, that we would have a reduction in funding levels that are lowest since before World War II. Now, I think everyone in looking along that line of the Clinton area budget funding know that along this timeline from 1976 to 2020, we are actually in one of the most dangerous areas of national security that we've been. Coming off the attack of 9/11, looking of the instability that's happening in the Middle East, the emerging threats from Iran and North Korea, this is not a time to take our budget down the lowest since before World War II. That also diminishes our overall standing in the international community and the ability to affect our foreign policy. Next slide. This shows again the levels of funding. If you look at the comparative of FY12, the cuts in yellow are those cuts that are already happened. So when people say, why aren't we cutting defense? We are cutting defense. You can see that going across each of the years to FY21. And we're cutting it in a way that takes it below the FY09 and FY12 significantly. The sequestration cuts would obviously take it even further below that to an area that even Secretary Panetta and Secretary Gates say would be dangerous from a Colorado force. Next slide. This again showing that these cuts, this is an interesting slide because it gives you an illustration that we're actually talking about real cuts and reduction. Many times people talk in Washington that something is being cut and they say, well, it's not a real cut because it's actually increased spending, it's a cut of future increases. But these are real cuts. Even the cuts that are occurring for the yellow show you that we go below our FY12 and FY13. Next slide. This is a slide that I think is really, that I'm going to leave up during this discussion that shows us what we're facing in Ohio. This is Bloomberg's estimate of what will happen with sequestration. They have an estimate of thousands of jobs, and this picture up here of Ohio shows us why it's important for us to do this today. If you see the concentric circles and the darker areas, you know, that's our community. If you look at the overall effect, if you talk about 6,000 jobs being lost in Ohio, you can see why we would be most heavily weighted. With that, I would like to again thank the elected officials and turn to Peggy Lehner for her opening comments.
Okay, thank you, Congressman. I appreciate the opportunity